So at this time, it is my privilege to introduce our lunchtime keynote speaker, David Plouffe. David is the head of policy and advocacy at the Zuckerberg Initiative. He's held senior positions in government and the private sector, including his role as manager of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And David has also served as a White House senior advisor and also chief advisor at Uber Technologies. His full bio is in your program, so I don't want to list all of those things and take up our time. Please join me in welcoming David Plouffe. Everyone here knows that you lead the Zuckerberg's initiative on justice and opportunity, which works to create a future for everyone that's more just, inclusive, and full of opportunity. What does that mean, and what does that mean for your current work and what you're focusing on?
Well, Gary, thanks for having us here today.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure to be with everyone. Well, we're a very young organization, so we're still asking a lot more questions than suggesting we have any answers. But for us, in our Justice and Opportunity Initiative right now, the issues that comprise most of that work are criminal justice reform, which is obviously a uniquely American problem, immigration reform, which is work Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan have been working on for some time. Some of that is obviously gotten more immediate and urgent around the last couple of years, but the goal is still comprehensive immigration reform here in the U.S. And then we're spending a lot of time and resources trying to be helpful around all the areas around the California housing crisis. Everything from helping fund new financial vehicles to being very involved in advocacy efforts in Sacramento. Hopefully Governor Newsom and the legislature can pass a lot of reform. So there's the issue areas, but what is at the root of it is, I'd say two things. One, our co-founder Priscilla Chan puts it, I think, really well, which is too often in America it seems like luck is our strategy. And so depending on the neighborhood you're born in, your family situation, do you have one or two amazing teachers, do you have a skirmish with the criminal justice system, so much is defined. And we may never completely take that out of the equation, but what can we do to get more predictability around people's pathway? And then for us as an organization, there's remarkable folks in government, outside government, philanthropy, private sector doing great things. So it's really just to figure out where can we either be additive in an important way or do something differentiated. And for us, that really, I think, so far is focused on two areas. So one, technology. We've about half of CZI are technologists, so engineers and data scientists and designers who are working on education products, science, technology in the criminal justice system. The folks who need the best technology, the best data and tools are teachers and criminal justice advocates and research scientists, and they usually don't have that. And so we're not going to fill that whole gap, but we're trying to find ways to be helpful and close it. And then we're very involved in policy and advocacy, which is, I give Mark and Priscilla credit, particularly given the fact that he is still running a public company that's not a quiet company. Because when you get engaged in policy and advocacy, you're taking positions. And for us, that means we get involved in ballot initiatives. We supported ballot initiatives here in California last year around housing and criminal justice around the country, support a lot of state legislative efforts, and supporting groups and trying to build capacity of groups who are trying to bring about change. Because, I think their view, which was right, which they could spend every dollar over the course of 50 years well, which they won't do. They could have the catalytic effect you hope to 100%, which it won't have. But honestly, if you're not willing to look at the big levers, which in most of these issues is policy makers, policies, you're not going to make the progress you want. So for us, we look at all those through the prism of what are the levers that can help bring about change. In some cases, it's grant making. In some cases, it's being involved in technology. In some cases, it's willing to support political efforts that can help move something across the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to criminal justice reform, what do you view as one of the greatest challenges to build inclusive futures for justice-involved youth and young adults? And then what is also the greatest opportunity, if you will, to level the playing field that is currently not leveled?
Well, I think there's a lot of folks here in the audience who've spent a lot longer time in the trenches of criminal justice reform than I have. I've seen it from my government time and in politics and now in philanthropy. But my view is the system's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to. So it is about incarceration. It's about punishment. It's not about redemption. It's not about safety. I was reading, one of our grantees recently wrote a book, and she wrote, if we were getting the safety outcomes out of mass incarceration you expected, this would be the safest place in the history of the world. So we could spend literally all year talking about all the different levers. So we as an organization given that there are so many inputs and so many places to focus, we had to figure out, like, where do we focus? So for us right now, it's really it's three areas. Prosecutorial transformation, which is everything from who gets elected to how do you support reform prosecutors in office. We're doing a lot of work, our tech team in Philadelphia with District Attorney Krasner, looking at new models around data and analytics to help decision-making there. It is striking to me, I have spent most of my life around data in politics and in government around business. And one of the most important decisions in our society is the one a prosecutor makes about charging. And it is not data informed. It's breathtakingly not data informed. So that we're focused very much on helping those who've been through the system and their families to have second chances. We're supporting Last Mile, very excited about that coding program that's here in California and a few other states. And something I'm really excited about, we've got a whole advocacy and organizing team at Chan Zuckerberg, folks who come from community backgrounds, political, to help with capacity building. And so the formerly incarcerated groups around the country are really showing such strength. They led the effort in Florida for restoration of voting rights. So we're spending a lot of time and resources to try and help them because they need to lead this debate. It should be people who've been impacted, who are leading the debate and are the faces of it, making decisions. And then we're spending a lot of our time on a third area, which is changing policy. So the good news is it's one of the few issues in America today with any momentum at all. We saw an important step at the federal level. This is obviously an issue that is most pronounced at the state and local level, but you are seeing across the country sentencing, bail, diversionary programs. A lot of, there's an important package, going on in Oklahoma right now. The state of Utah just passed clean slate legislation to automatically remove folks' record, which is something we need to see in all 50 states. So we're doing what we can. A lot of that's just working with local groups to give them the resources they need. That's one of my observations from my time in politics is there's a lot of like, can we capture carbon in the atmosphere? So that's something we haven't figured out, or at least that's scalable financially. But for the most part, we know what to do on a lot of these issues. It's not about the white paper that's missing. It's about the ability to get across the finish line, whether that's politically or legislatively. And so really to support groups, like in Utah, to go in it, what do you need to get this piece of legislation through the legislature and the governor to sign it? What do you need today? That session is like 3 weeks. So I think that the urgency around that, I think particularly in criminal justice, I don't think we're going back to the days of the Nixon and Reagan in the 70s and 80s and what led to mass incarceration. But this moment is not necessarily going to last forever. And so while the window's open where you have strong bipartisan support, where you got support across business sector, faith sector, still some turbulence in the law enforcement sector, but more law enforcement officials standing up for reform. You've got to basically get as much across the finish line as possible. So I think that's really important, is to take advantage of this window, because what's clear is without policy change at the state level and at the county level, all the best ideas, all the best resources are not ultimately going to solve the problem, at least to the degree we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. So despite being a Center for Social Innovation and everyone sitting here at a Social Innovation Summit, I think your conversation points out, and we agree wholeheartedly, that a lot of the work we have to do is to actually trigger those traditional policy levers effectively. So we don't need social innovation processes to solve all of these problems. Sometimes we actually know what we have to do, we just have to figure out how to get there, how to diffuse promising practices, and I love your example of how that's happening in the criminal justice area. To move to a slightly different area that I know you're working on and you mentioned earlier, issues around improving housing stability in communities. How do you see the work of Chan Zuckerberg kind of impacting that ecosystem to promote housing stability?
Well, there's such amazing work happening already. So our first principle is, how can we support the work that's already going on? So for us, that takes a few different, and obviously housing, like the criminal justice system, housing in California, well, nationally, but here in California to speak about that, there's obviously not one lever, and there wasn't one cause of the problem. And so I think that obviously we need a lot more supply. I say obviously, not everybody agrees with that, but the politics around this have changed pretty significantly in the last 4 years. So the appetite of the general public and even the intensity, which is important. In politics today, general support doesn't matter. You have to have intensity. The group or the people who have intensity can win. If you don't have intensity, you're not going to get it across the finish line. That's why issues that have a lot of public support, 75, 80, 85%, if they don't have intensity, particularly if it's intense both right and left in a positive way, it's not going to get done. So in housing, you're starting to see so much of the intensity was on the, the so-called YIMBY side. We're not going to build. That's changed a little bit. So there's an opportunity. I think Governor Newsom's talked about a Marshall Plan trying to produce 3.5 million new units in California. Think about that deficit. That's a deficit today. So supporting efforts and some of that's going to be legislative reform. We're part of a fund that was announced a few weeks ago called Partnership for the Bay Area, which is to both provide policy-related funds for local governments so that they can be more innovative, but also making more funds available for workforce and low-income production. So the innovation there is we as a philanthropist are willing to come in and take first loss, essentially. And if we're willing to take first loss from a financial standpoint, a bunch of other resources come in on top of that. And hopefully we can see that elsewhere. Strengthening, we do a lot of grant making to housing groups in the Bay Area and across the state who are trying to organize, create more intensity, get more people involved in legislative efforts. This is a big year in Sacramento. I mean, there are now at least 10 really important bills that are working their way through the process. And I've learned in politics, like you don't get many chances, baseball season just started yesterday, so I'll use a baseball term. You really don't get many chances at the plate. You got to take advantage when you're stepping up there. And so I think all of us that want to see smart reform that doesn't focus just on production, but also preservation and protection, really in a balanced approach, need to do all we can to support the efforts in Sacramento. Because if this moment fades away and we don't come near realizing the potential, what's possible from a policy standpoint, it's going to take years and years and years to dig out from under that. And we know housing should be a fundamental human right. It's not. Here in California, you've got people who are literally, there was a study that just came out last week about students at San Jose State University, 14% homeless during the school year. We obviously see school districts all over the state, K through 12, where children are homeless. And so it obviously is linked to the immigration problems we have, criminal justice system, education. But this is the core of so much that's important. But what makes me optimistic is, again, the winds have shifted. I don't want to overstate that. There's still plenty of opposition. But the winds have shifted in a pretty short period of time. And, I've consumed a lot of political research, voter research through my life here in California and elsewhere. And when you ask voters about what they're willing to do around housing, it's changed significantly just in 4 years. And part of that is there's been a lot of great data journalism done, a lot of news coverage. I think political figures are starting to be a little more courageous about. We just had a mayor of San Francisco get elected, and her really number one argument was we need to build more housing. I don't think that election would have happened 4 years ago. So, there's positive signs. The legislature did do some smart things during Governor Brown's last session, but we need to do a lot more.
A point that you made earlier, that we actually get the outcomes for the system we created with criminal justice, drew at least 2 pieces of applause I heard over here. I think the same thing is exactly true as you were alluding to in housing, right? We've actually created a system where building didn't happen for 25, 30 years, and therefore we get the outcomes of housing instability that we, again, collectively created. So thinking back to your days as a campaign manager, the 2008 campaign, obviously you have engaged social movement. You had kind of new ways to leverage technology to actually push forward a social movement in ways that hadn't happened before. How do you think about approaching or using the tools of social movement to address these issues of criminal justice reform and or housing instability?
Well, when you look historically at any movement of significance that was a contributor to progress, you can't engineer a movement. So oftentimes in politics, I'll have this discussion with people thinking about running for office or currently in an office who want to seek a higher office. I want to build a grassroots campaign. Good luck. It's either there or it's not. People either are excited about you or they're not. Now, if you have that passion, whether it's around an issue like housing or it's in politics, if you've got passion and you've got people who are willing to think about how busy people are. People don't have time for anything. So if they're willing to actually give you an hour or 2 a week, they feel passionate about it. So then, of course, it's the obligation of those who want to nourish that to build technology, build tools, give the resources to organizations to take advantage of that. So in criminal justice, you have a moment now where you've got people on both sides of the political spectrum, you've got business leaders, you've got the formerly incarcerated who want to really break through the wall and make progress. So that's great. And so the question for all of us who want to support that is, what's the best way to support that? I think in housing, it's not where criminal justice is, but you're starting to see that. So the test for me will be if there's a board of supervisors meeting in a county in California around housing, are there more people showing up on the pro-production side than the anti? That's like a simple, like old school test, eye test, important. Are they getting involved in politics and supporting and nourishing those that want a balanced but urgent approach to housing? You know, and so I think that movements cannot be created. They can be nourished, they can be funded, they can be, I think, accelerated with good technology and good tools. But at the end of the day, it's human beings being passionate about something. And you know, one of the problems I think on immigration right now, you see the support, comprehensive immigration reform, 85%, Dreamers 85%. Quite frankly, the intensity is more on the right than the left. We need more people. I mean, you know, people feel strongly about it, they have views, but are they willing to go to the mat for that? And I think oftentimes in issues, we focus on support levels. And I've always believed in terms of issues, the most important thing is salience. How would you compare your support on this issue and intensity on this issue to another issue? I think oftentimes public research fails in that regard. It just says this issue has X support. Well, let's dig down beneath that. What's the intensity? Because with the intensity, you then understand, are people willing to give up their time and their treasure? Will they vote on it? And will the politicians understand that there's intensity? So you really have to look at issues compared to each other, not in isolation. But I think in both criminal justice all across the country, whether it's here in LA County, it's in rural Oklahoma, it's in the central part of Pennsylvania, you see people passionate about this. And they understand that we have to change. So I think our job as an organization, others, is just how do we nourish that? And again, I'm super excited about the formerly incarcerated groups and leaders who really want to become more and more the folks who are driving these issue campaigns and policy campaigns in the states. They should. And so we've got to figure out ways to make sure that they've got the resources to do that.
On that issue, do you have a specific example that you can point to where you recognized, either when you were campaigning for Obama or in some of this recent work, where you recognized that this issue was salient, that there was already a grassroots movement happening, and there was a particular tool or set of resources that were able to activate and nourish what was already happening on the ground? Do you have a favorite example in that space that, you know, could maybe speak to the work that everyone here in the audience is doing?
Well, I think, you know, from politics, like back in the 08 campaign, which, you know, seems like, you know, a time before meteors struck the earth, it was so long ago. But, you know, we were fortunate to have a huge amount of people who clearly were way ahead of the campaign and like, hey, we want to get to organizing our community. And so we built, you know, back then relatively crude technology. But, you know, we built a social networking site called mybarackobama.com because Facebook was only on campuses back then to allow folks to organize, to meet each other. I think we do see that right now in criminal justice. I mean, the folks who are in the formerly incarcerated movement, the coalitions that are emerging in local areas, none of that is being created. It's all happening. And so again, the question is, what kind of grant making, what kind of technological assistance, what kind of training, policy development do folks need? In some cases, it will be very little. In some cases, it may just be financial resources. And I think that's important. One of the things I've observed, and I'm still kind of a rookie in philanthropy, is the answer is always fine if the answer is simply a grant or support. I think sometimes we can overcomplicate things and, well, what about this lever, and what about this lever, and what about this level? Well, maybe all they need is our financial support, and they'll handle it from there. I think that's super important. So I think, and then, you know, you look at the movement around gay marriage, which historically happened very quickly. But you started with a relatively small core group of people who supported that. And don't forget, they lost every ballot initiative they put on through the 80s and 90s. Every single one. Got back off the mat, learned from it, let's go back and let's go back. And over time, back to my point about intensity and salience, you know, it grew much broader than that. And you had people of every background, every part of this country, believing very strongly and getting involved financially and politically. And so, again, I think there's lots of examples of that. But again, none of that was manufactured. And the tragedy is when you do have intensity and you've got human beings who want to go help get something done. The tragedy then, of course, is, because that's hard, that doesn't exist in a lot of issues. So the hardest thing is that. So the tragedy would be for folks like that not to have the resources or the technology to take advantage of that, which is such a precious thing. And maybe it's not ephemeral, but it also doesn't last forever.
Yeah. So one of the keys is to find how do you translate that to voice and power, right? And so I do want to just ask one last question to tee it off. I might use my moderator's prerogative to ask a few more later, and so get ready with your questions. We'll turn it over to the audience in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about technology, what it can do as a complementary resource, as a supplementary resource, as a way to kind of save costs, to try to mobilize, to do these things. You know, I think everyone in the room recognizes that there's an app for that as not a solution to some of the complex issues that we face. Yet, technology can play a critical role, a nourishing role, et cetera. How do you think about technology in these spaces? Is it different depending on each situation, or are there some lessons learned that might be universal as it relates to how technology can catalyze or nourish these catalytic changes we're talking about?
Right. Well, technology is certainly not going to be a savior in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I'd say, you know, this is not a revelatory observation, but I'll share it anyway. So before we get to, I think, substantive and use case for technology, we just have to understand user experience, right? So particularly the younger generation. The patience level is 0. They expect awesome user experience with no delay. I mean, what's that study that came out last year about a pretty rapid decrease in consumption of breakfast cereal by, I think they looked at Gen Z and millennials. And the number one reason, 40% of the people said, they did not consume breakfast cereal because it took too long to clean up. Okay? So for someone of my vintage, that's hard to understand. It's a world we're living in. Okay? When I used to, work at Uber, like if the wait time was 5 or 10 seconds more than you wanted, you were in big trouble. In politics, if you're trying to get a 19-year-old to register to vote or figure out where to vote, if it takes more than 5 seconds, you've lost them. So we have to understand, like, whether we're government or philanthropy, this is what people expect. I remember back in 2007, so this is a long time ago, when Barack Obama started running for president, we didn't have any institutional support to speak of. People forget that. We were the outsider. The one place where we probably had the majority of institutional support was in the tech industry. Okay? So I personally and my team spent a lot of time, mostly in Northern California, a little bit down here. And we started with how can we have a better website and digital experience than like John McCain will have or Hillary Clinton. And what was interesting is folks told us that's the wrong question. If you want people to like hang with you and spend time on your digital platforms, it's got to be as good as Amazon, the New York Times, any like consumer website. Huge bar, and they're right. People don't discriminate. It's not like you're on your smartphone, you're like, hey, I'm shopping on Amazon, or I'm getting news from the LA Times. Now I'm going to go to a church or an academic institution or philanthropy and expect a crappy experience.
Yeah.
Doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's super important with technology. But then from technology, so I think you just have to say, like, what's missing?
Yeah.
Right? So if you're, again, a prosecutor, it'd be great if before you made a charging decision, you had data that showed life outcomes. So you could factor that into what you were doing. If you're a local criminal justice group in Kentucky, it would be great if you had the kind of technology and data to understand where's my next 1,000 donors coming from? Where are my next 500 volunteers coming through? Those of us in high level and expensive politics or the private sector, that's just stuff we take for granted. Doesn't exist in a lot of local groups. The kind of sophistication around the market. Teachers having the kind of technology in the classroom. Just as a supplement to their core approach, but to allow them to understand their students better and engage with them in a way that's consistent with their strengths and weaknesses and desires. Science, a lot of the work we support now is just trying to get more collaboration around science so that we can accelerate the pace of discovery, particularly around human cells. So I think I approach it as the people in our society who need the best technology, the best data, the best tools, the best predictive analytics oftentimes don't have it. So that in and of itself is not going to solve the problem, but it will make them more effective. I think in most of the spaces we've talked about today, there is no one product or app or piece of data that's going to solve the problem. But as part of a suite of solutions, it's pretty darn important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've given us really cool insights to date. We're in a room where people have intensity, and so I want to hear from them, and they can offer their questions to you. So who would like to be first?
Yes, hi, I'm Philip Armstrong with the LA Promise Zone. And my question, since you mentioned prosecutorial decisions and using data to make decisions that in some ways might be more equitable, that made me think of plea bargaining decisions. And there's, I believe, some evidence to show that two people who are in that situation are going to react differently based on their neighborhoods that they grew up in, let's say, and the resources that they had. And so is that something that you're looking at, and have you come up with strategies or solutions that you could share with us?
Well, our tech work in the criminal justice system is both new and relatively modest. So we're spending a lot of time, as I mentioned, in Philadelphia. So one of the great things about looking at data is a lot is revealed, right? Whether that's individual line prosecutor decisions or racial inequities that are revealed from the data. So I think whether it's education or criminal justice or housing, making sure that you are not, so faithful to algorithms that they bake in existing racial inequality, I think is really important. But I certainly believe the more that we are able to use data to, particularly when you're able to link it to longitudinal. I mean, this is why the work Raj Chetty does is so important, obviously, and what it's revealed about. What shocked, when you look at that data, and we're proud to fund Raj in his work, and some of the differences just in like a 3 to 4 block area in a city are pronounced. So this is, again, where data. Do most of the people who are making decisions about where to live in a city have access to that data? Of course not. Should they? Of course they should. It doesn't ultimately mean they might make a different decision, but shouldn't a parent be able to see, like, okay, let me look at that historical data in terms of income production, educational outcomes, health outcomes, transportation costs. Think about that. That is a knowable, doable thing that's not available to people who are making incredibly important life decisions. Now, of course, you'll see in that data, and all the data I think we're talking about today, and that's the thing, you have to stare at it, you can't ignore it, that housing, immigration, criminal justice, education, historical, racial inequality and injustice is at the core of so much of that. And I think we all have to understand that and bake that into the decisions we make. And understand as we're looking at data that there's going to be really important factors there. But I think in a lot of the spaces we're talking about today, just the kind of data the most modern consumer companies in the world would have to make decisions doesn't exist, and that's a tragedy, in my view.
That's great. Another question. John?
Yeah, question. John McDonald, I'm a professor of criminology at Penn. So you mentioned, well, first a comment. You mentioned the finish line, but I would say it's the starting line. And then my question for you was, based on your experience in interacting with criminal justice agencies and people trying to do work, what era would you say their data infrastructure is in? Is it in the 1950s, 60s? What's your perspective on the level of information they actually have?
Well, it varies tremendously, as you can imagine. So what's interesting is actually the data infrastructure and the IT infrastructure in Philadelphia is actually quite good. One of the problems there is you've got data living in all parts of the city that doesn't talk to each other, and that actually the district attorney doesn't have access to or control of. So that's a big problem. So everywhere you go, it's a different story. I think in some cases it might be more like the 2000s even, but given the pace of change, that's like the 1600s. In some cases it is like, we know that. That's one of the challenges is best practice around data and predictive analytics and modeling is advancing at such a rapid pace almost every month, much less every year. So some are in the 70s or 80s, and a lot of paper. And when you've got line prosecutors having to make just the sheer rapidity of the decisions they have to make. They're making charging decisions, obviously, many of them every hour. Oftentimes not even though they themselves would be desirous of it, they don't have access to the data they need. So it's a big problem. So I think that it's IT, it's data infrastructure, it's longitudinal data, it's making sure all that works together, it's making sure it's put together in a I think, easy-to-use visual and user experience presentation for the consumers of that data. So massive challenges. So for us, again, we're starting pretty modestly. And again, the other thing you'll find about tools and data is, I think, in the criminal justice system, and this is true, I think, in a lot of areas, but you know, we don't think there's probably like one product that's going to be right for every jurisdiction. So for us, the question is, we can't necessarily, as an organization, become a consultant to every DA out there. So how do we focus on things that might have chance of some applicability and some scale, even if not exactly tied to what's happening in that jurisdiction? But it's pretty frightening. It's pretty frightening. And so for me, coming from, and I saw this, listen, when I went from a campaign to government, the difference in technology and data infrastructure was massive. Like, that's just not okay.
Yeah.
Campaign was like, maybe not a Ferrari, but at least like, you know, maybe a Lexus. And government was like a 1974 Yugo. Okay? I got into the government, I'm like, man, here we go, Windows 5 or whatever it was. So, true story. And, you know, I've seen a lot of progress in government, but I remember in the early days of the Obama administration where you're having a funding discussion, like this job training program or this education program. Do we have all the data to make an informed decision? It's gotten better, but so many of these debates, even today in state legislatures or in Washington, are not grounded in that. So therefore it becomes ideological and philosophical. Like, let's look at the data, and not just data of how many people have served, how many people went through the program, how many people were changed. What are the outcomes? And for me as a progressive, I think the burden is even more so on a progressive to have that approach. Because if you want to argue for a dollar, you better be able to say it worked, and not just in some fuzzy statistics, that you're getting the outcomes that you want. And that's, I think, ultimately how you can build more trust and support for that. So it's gotten better across the board, but I think the criminal justice space in particular is acutely behind what you would consider best practice.
Well, I'm glad we didn't name any coarse, fuzzy statistics for those of you who are students in the room. Next question. Over here in this corner. Oh, yes. Go ahead. Okay. Yes.
Good afternoon, David. Thank you so much for being here. From a fellow Obama campaigner back from his U.S. senatorial days in Chicago.
That
really
is old
glad
school.
to be here. Yes, yes. And it's really interesting because your last comment actually segues into my question. And definitely understand the climate that we're in when it comes to funding, that it needs to be evidence-based, but wondering how we can get support for social innovation, and especially in communities of color and low to moderate income communities that may not have the capacity to really track their performance and evidence-based solutions that are impactful, and how do we really ensure that we get the funding support to support that kind of work and that social innovation that makes a difference, but we may not have the data for.
Yeah, well, I think it can be a super laborious project, obviously, in process, because just the process to really evaluate both the raw data you have and the delta between that and what you need, you know, can obviously take many, many years. So it starts there. I actually think that support for social innovation, though, does have, and we have to be careful about this from my view, which is, you know, it does have, I think, appeal to folks left, center, and right in our political spectrum, because it is based on evidence, and it's based how to get more efficiency and more impact for every dollar. Of course, we still have to spend a lot more money than we're spending. So I always worry when people gravitate to things like that would suggest there's a shortcut or a way to get your outcome without the resources you need. So I think it starts with a lot of pilots, with organizations like this, with organizations like ours, with governments. We live in an era where storytelling's actually gotten a lot easier too. So it used to be, not too long ago actually, you know, you would have a social innovation pilot in a city, and maybe you'd hope for the state capitol newspaper to cover it, and maybe the Times might do it, maybe they wouldn't. You know, could you get one of the networks interested? Now your ability to tell a story is obviously so profound. And so I think part of any, this is easier to address in many ways than the hard work, but like, have you taken account of what audiences can you reach directly, and how are you going to tell that story in a visual way, and how are you going to get influencers to talk about it? Like, that is a place where I'm optimistic, which is good ideas and good findings have an easier way now to find the places you want them to find than they used to, and it happens much more quickly. And I think particularly because we're still dealing with, if you're looking, let's say you've got a social innovation pilot, and you're hoping then maybe for the city council to provide funding for more work there, or to expand it, or state capital. Like, you've got social media, obviously, to reach those influencers, but the media still matters. I always tell this to my team, some of my younger team, it's like, hey, a good story that's driven by data in a state capital newspaper still matters. Maybe one of the only places you can say that of, but it still matters. Because that committee chair may see it, and it may either give them more motivation, maybe it doesn't change their mind, but it may make them a little more open. It's super important. So I think a lot of this, so I'm less of an expert in terms of like RCTs and actually pilots on the ground, but in terms of what you do with that, like just really having a sophisticated view of your audience and what's the best way to reach them, and who are the best storytellers, so you can create more interest, I think is really, really important. And and ultimately, is it something that you're trying to achieve X, $1 million funding? Who are your most likely suspects? Is it something you need a vote in a city council? Who's the swing council vote? Is it a state legislative? Who's the 2 state senators that are most impactful? And just build a campaign around that. And what's amazing to me about a lot of this policy work is it can seem super hard, and like, how do we get from 0 to 100? And a lot of times it is, and a lot of times you're unsuccessful. But it's also pretty, over time, easy to understand, like, what's the barrier? How do you pick, where do you need to pick the lock? And how do you kind of build a campaign around either the blocker or the accelerant? And I think, again, in a lot of these policy spaces, you're not talking about needing to change the mind of 60 million people or even 6 million people. Sometimes it's just coming down to a pretty small ecosystem around a couple decision makers.
Absolutely. I think we have the next person with a mic. Please stand up. And
sure, thanks. Hi, thanks for being here. I have a question about disproportionate policing and whether or not that's something that Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is looking into. We talked a little bit about the data that's needed for prosecutors to make better decisions, but I'm wondering about the beginning of the funnel when we are moving people from communities into the criminal justice system, and some data that we've seen about disproportional resources from police departments being focused on specific communities versus others, and whether or not that's something you guys are looking at, and what you think about the data that we have available on that front end of the funnel.
Right. Obviously a critical issue, and something a lot of great organizations are spending a lot of time on. So for us, that's not a focus area, not because it's not important, just we have to focus. So, I mean, this is less about the issues we're working on, but just an organizational observation, because I've been through quite a few startups through the years, and I think the particularly one, so we have young founders who have both a long time frame, and we've got enough resources over time to be pretty adventuresome about what we think about working on. But healthy organizations grow super modestly. And so for us, the 3 areas I talked about, transforming prosecution, working on more opportunities for those who've been impacted, and then policy change, you can make an argument for an organization of our size that's already too much. So that's just, so there are police procedures and data around that. There's obviously all sorts of environmental factors that go into the top of the funnel. Changing the way we actually conduct incarceration. You look at what some of the Scandinavian countries are doing and some of the pilots here, pretty revelatory. All amazing things, but for us as an organization, we had to say, where do we focus? Where do we think is the right place for us to start? Where do we think our mix of technology, our willingness to get involved in politics and advocacy and organizing, where can that play the best role alongside the people already doing great work? It was really those areas.
Hi, my name is Alexa Russo. I've been working with Homeboy Industries, and I work with other reentry programs that are having great impact. And my question is, Throughout the years, I've seen many leaders within Homeboy Industries, people who've gone to start their own foundations, agencies. They all have incredible voices. They're not working together. Is there a world where you guys would have some sort of incubator or opportunity for all these different leaders throughout, I know for sure in our city, who can really speak with passion and move the needle? Is there a way for them to get together so that they can improve on their skills, so that they can get more of a platform and use their transformations and the way that they're helping and healing thousands of people to make it millions of people to actually change policy?
I've read a little bit about your program. You obviously do great work at Homeboy. So I think, one of the reasons, we have a team of folks at Chan Zuckerberg who work on capacity building. And what's interesting about that is most of that work, yes, it can be about helping an individual organization strengthen their training or improve their technology. But for the most part, it's cohort, right? So with the formerly incarcerated groups around the country, it's how do we, yes, professionalize and improve our own organizations, but the big goal is how do we work better together? Same thing with a lot of the housing work we're doing here in California, helping groups that are doing remarkable work on their own do it better together. So again, I'm new to philanthropy, so these are probably not as worthy observations as many of you have. I mean, sometimes politics can be like Keystone Cops, right? But for the most part in politics, it's like you're trying to win an election in a state or a country. It's like, who's everybody who's got people, money, and let's figure out a way to orchestrate that and organize it in a way so we're being not duplicative and people understand where their lanes are. So my sense is in philanthropy, which again differs a lot on different sectors, there's not a lot of conflict and people are rowing roughly in the same direction, not all the time, but it's not as coordinated as it could be, right? And I think that's true in politics. It's never as coordinated as it could be. So the goal would be, and I think sometimes that's easier on like a short term. So if you're trying to pass a piece of legislation around sentencing reform, all the groups in a particular state, it's easier to create a table and say, okay, who's going to do the lobbying and who's going to do grassroots and who's going to do the media. By the way, when that doesn't happen, you've dramatically decreased your odds of success. So you have to create a table and make sure you're maximizing efficiency and understanding who does what well. I think it gets harder over time when you're thinking about, whether it's prevention programs or it's rehabilitation programs for people who've come out of the criminal justice system. There's so many amazing projects and programs and organizations going on, but are all those groups able to talk as well as they can, share data? Probably not. And so I think it is a really great aspiration to get better at that. I think in the short term, it is easier around a moment, right? But then how do you make that stickier? So I've been struck by that I think, for the most part, you got people really directionally heading in the right direction, but are you always being as clear of like, okay, here's the 100% of the problem we're trying to solve, and let's figure out who's got resources, people, technology, data, relationships, and what's the best way to put that all together? It's a really interesting question. And something hopefully, again, we're not going to, as an organization, all we can be is be part of folks talking about that, but I think some of the capacity building work we hope to go over time can be useful, because that's, when we survey folks about what they're most interested in around capacity building, it's more often not about their own organization. It's about we'd like to figure out a way to strengthen cohort organizations so that we are more powerful together.
That's great.
Thank you for coming today. I'm Mimi Bolton from the McMorrow Neighborhood Academic Initiative. My question is, how impactful do you think disinformation programs are? So we're all working in a positive space. This is what I'm working on. Please be involved. But how are we counteracting false narratives, and what is the work going toward that so that we can dispel things? Is there work that you're doing in that realm?
It's a great question. So again, one of the in our nascent work, we are doing quite a bit of research around the attitudes of people. So we've done some criminal justice work, we've done some in immigration, we're doing around housing, science, just baseline. Basic, like, let's understand attitudes and where people are getting information, and is it an area they might be willing to become more intense? Because it's great when someone says, I support sentencing reform, or I support more funding from the NIH. Well, how intense do they feel about it? Will they actually get involved? So I think it's super important. That's one of the things we over time want to make sure we're sharing. So here in California, we're doing a lot of that work with housing advocates, because what doesn't exist is a super sophisticated look of where is the California population on a whole variety of housing questions, right. Which again, are not all the same. So you may have somebody who supports one element of reform, not another, and are they intense? So super important. So it starts with understanding of where people are. So I'd say a couple things, less about really maybe with my CZI hat on, but just my experience through the years. So one, because the disinformation is out there and it's growing and it's more insidious, it makes it more important for you to take the microphone as strongly as you can and have a powerful story that overwhelms the disinformation. And you got to be doing it every day. If you're not telling your story, no one's telling your story. It's just an old saying, but it's true, and it's even more true today. So how are you freshening up your story, sharing new data, new voices, so that people believe it and are more interested? Now, the challenge is, how much do you fight back against the disinformation? Because we could all do that every day. And it's like whack-a-mole. I've been thinking about this next election coming up, and one of my piece of advice for people, which they don't like when I say it, I'm thinking about ways to scale this advice, is you got to get in the cesspool. You see something that's crazy, you got to say, that's not right, and grab a piece of content and say, here's the truth. So I think I would put more premium on what's the story I want to tell, what's the data I want to share, what's the relationships I want to make. That should be like 80%. But I think you do have to factor in if you see something that says, we see the power of this with the anti-vaccination movement, and so many of the areas where, and listen, what we haven't seen is some of the state actors who got involved in our politics, they eventually could get involved in some of the spaces we're talking about today, criminal justice in particular, and make that harder. So I think that, but this is where passion comes in. So if you've got passionate supporters, okay, they're living their life, they're working, they're raising their kids, they're doing volunteer work, but they see something on their phone that they don't think is true, they might be willing to fire back. And what does that matter? I've always believed that it's people who believe things, it's hard to change their minds. Sometimes you do. But when you stand up and say, whether it's a Facebook feed or it's an email chain, and say, that's not true, the other people on that chain or that feed who agree with you will get the courage to do it too. Bobby Kennedy famously talked about, when people stand up for a cause or ideal, one person, it causes ripples of hope. Well, we need ripples of people out there who are engaging in fighting disinformation. It's not going to be one algorithm or one organization or one brilliant idea. It's going to have to be decentralized response. So, but if all you're doing is playing defensive whack-a-mole, you're not going to ultimately win. So I think we really, whether again it's a program or it's a pilot as we talked about earlier, or it's a research study that comes in, right? Or it's just a great human story. I just think we all have an obligation to figure out, and it's not propaganda, it's not marketing, how do you capture that? Because that's what changes hearts and minds, it's what gets people to financially contribute, it's what gets people to tell time, to give their time. So incredibly important. So if you've got something important that's happened, a milestone, I do think it's really important to say, how can we capture this? And listen, written reports have their place, op-eds have their place, but every day we become more visual-oriented as a society. And so you really have to think, how am I going to tell this story visually or with video? And if you don't do that, you're not going to reach anybody, in my view. You've really got to think about that. And whether we like it or not, social media is the new public square, and that's where so much of these debates are happening. And so to understand, I see this in politics. I still talk to some people in politics, even though I'm retired, people running for president. And sometimes folks still think about, I'm going to hold a press conference and I'm going to talk to this reporter about my idea. It's like, hey man, it's not 1980. or a woman, you got to think like Instagram first, Facebook first, Twitter first. Like, you just have to be oriented in that way. And I think that's hard. It's hard for someone of my vintage who came through politics and would think about, or issues. And think about, like, you have a study and you have a press conference and you brief a reporter, and all that's important, but it's more supplemental to the main engines that drive interest in content and policy and issues these days, which is social media platforms. Whether we like it or not, that's the world we're living in.
David, I liked how you mentioned that sometimes capacity building is about building connective tissue, across organizations, within issue areas, and those kinds of things. As it relates to housing instability issues, sometimes, it's not obvious to everyone who's working on issues of housing instability that they are connected. And sometimes there's a little bit of fear, to be quite frank, that if we're focusing on homelessness, that we're going to lose focus on workforce housing. And the lack of building and rehabbing workforce housing might have been one of those key causes to why we have the kind of housing cost challenges we have today. Are there techniques, are there things that you've observed, again, not just with your new hat on in the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, but kind of over the past 20, 30 years, that can build those connective tissues that may have been kind of contested areas where people might be even fighting for dollars?
Well, I do think the more you build connective tissue, which only works if there's trust. So housing, transportation, of course, is connected to housing. Education is connected to housing. The criminal justice, like, everything's connected to housing. And so I think if you have a durable coalition of people who trust each other, who've done battle together, then there's a little bit more willingness to not be, I have to eat the whole piece of pie. Like, and to understand that all these pieces work together. And ultimately, if you believe that we need to be building more rail and light rail and additional transportation options. Let's say there's a choice between spending $1 to build housing around existing public transportation or build new public transportation. I think we should do both. We can do both. But I'm just saying, in that argument, building the housing, even if you would personally choose as a group or as a person to build the transportation, is going to lead to better transportation outcomes and more money there. So part of this is playing the long game, which is hard because we live in a very toxic political environment where resources probably aren't as scarce as they are suggested they are, but still scarce. So I think it does come down to trust. And the more we are looking at these issues globally and understanding that maybe an intervention that may not be as connected to your core issue area as another, but still is going to have some adjacent positive outcomes, and maybe that issue's ripe right now, I think is really important. So this is where it is more art than science, and all these endeavors are still, maybe 20 years from now, they won't be, but folks who are running organizations and making budget decisions are all human beings. And that's the beauty of it, and sometimes the tax of it. And getting those folks all to row in the same direction and understand sometimes their issue might be the next one on deck, not the right one on deck. It's hard though. It's hard though. And by the way, I always found when I was in government, some of the most impactful conversations would actually be, so if you are working on an issue and you're known to work on that issue and you've got a track record, and you come in, I kind of already know what you're going to say. It's when somebody who may not have that history, or may say, you know what, I'm actually focused on this issue, but today I'm here to talk to you about this issue, like, oh, that's interesting, I'm all ears. And so it's important to think about, I think, different messengers. So incredibly important, I think, particularly in the jaundiced environment. Like, I remember back, just to use my old example of politics, right? So if in a campaign, somebody like me says, here's why you should support a Democrat. Like, my family's like, I don't need to, I know what you're going to say. Like, I have no time for what you're going to say. But someone who says, you know what, I've historically voted Republican, but this time I'm going to support the Democrats. Why? I want to hear that. Or I've never voted before. I've never even registered, but I'm doing it this time. Let me tell you why. Or, somebody who might say, I've only been focused in housing on the supply side of things, on the production. But I actually think this piece of legislation is important from a protection standpoint. Wow, that can be super impactful to that state legislator. So this is where coalitions are so important, where it's like, you know what, Gary, you're probably better to talk about this to this state legislator or committee chair than I am, because they think that I'm, maybe not biased is the right word, but they already know where I'm coming from. But you, the big developer, coming in saying, you know, we need to do more on protection, that can be super powerful. And I think that's important when you think about, like, how do we have diverse coalitions? It's also people who can have those important conversations at key moments.
Absolutely. And we have time for one more question. We have a few hands up. Oh, go ahead. You have one.
Yeah.
And maybe a second while we'll sneak in.
Okay. My name is Becky Modesto. I'm with Price Philanthropies. And it goes to what you were just speaking of, is how do we have the legislation speak to each other with data? With affordable housing, which we desperately need, and I live and work in City Heights, which in San Diego. And so we have a passing where you don't need parking for affordable housing, which helps the developers, but also we don't have the infrastructure right now to support that. I mean, most of my neighbors' livelihood is in their car, right? So if you're a plumber or you clean houses or you are metal recycling, that can't really go on a bus or public transportation. So I'm just thinking, how does the data inform the legislation so that we're working together to have the infrastructure in place to support the affordable housing we desperately need?
No, I mean, you identified that's a great specific example. So I just think we have to think aspirationally about getting there. So on something like that, you'd say, okay, this is a development project actually where you could waive parking requirements because we have the data to inform the habits of how people get to work and take care of kids. And this particular area is not. That's not eligible. And too often, that is driven more by sort of, whim is not a generous enough word, but like, I get like, there are too many parking requirements in most states in this country, okay? It's not the 1970s, but one size doesn't fit all. So there may be, I know like Mayor Emanuel in Chicago has been very aggressive about this, and I think is doing a good job looking at data, which is, this is a place where actually we can waive it entirely, or we can cut it by a quarter in terms of the number of parking places, which is great, obviously, because it does reduce the cost. But this is a place where it's not, where people are, from a habit standpoint, transportation point. So it's a tragedy that decisions like that aren't as fused by much data. I mean, I think if you're an optimist, you say this is a solvable problem, even on housing. So if the delta is 3.5 million, one of the things we think a lot about and are doing some funding with folks like the Turner Center of Berkeley and others is, it is possible to know with a lot more, I think, clarity than we know now, how do you get to the 3.5? How do you get there? What are all the levers? And a bunch of those levers, by the way, are not isolated. They have dependencies. But we should be able to score these things, you know, even from a piece of legislation. This piece of legislation could potentially create 112,000. And this one could be responsible for 250,000. And this one actually sounds awesome, but it would only produce 50,000. So that clearly is not enough part of but these are, you know, a lot of the problems in our society right now are ones we do not have the answers to. Or you say the delta between when we might have the answers or the capabilities and now is too long. Like, the example you used is doable today. But it's hard. It's the gathering of all the data, the analysis of the data, to factor it into decision-making in the right way on the front end. You know, I think there is still often in many state legislatures and in Washington, if you're talking about drafting a piece of legislation, there should be, at the table, in my view, someone who represents the user experience side of that from a technology standpoint, and someone who's from the data standpoint. A lot of you guys spend time in local government, state government, federal government. When you have those meetings, is that who you're talking to? Usually not. So like just front end, it would be great. And by the way, one place I have optimism is there's plenty of folks, my generation and older, who that is their approach around data. But just from a generational standpoint, as you see younger people who are more facile, I have some optimism there. So some of the young prosecutors who are either getting elected or becoming line prosecutors, like that's their orientation. And they're not super excited to wait 10 years for, I need the data now to make the decision. So I think you'll see more of a push and more of an orientation there, which is terrific. But that's a great example where, yeah, we are too many developments from a residential standpoint or even from a commercial standpoint have outdated parking requirements. Yeah, I think that's true in most jurisdictions. But does that mean we should have a one-size-fits-all approach to that? No. And the data around that is known. It is known. Or if it's not known, the delta between what you need to really gather that data and analyze it to inform policymaking and not, of all the problems in the world, this is a solvable problem. So it's a great example where if we paint with too broad of a brush, something that sounds good, which is more and more people are using rideshare or using public transportation or whatever they're doing. Yeah, but even in a city, the difference of just a few blocks can make a big difference in terms of access. And we know that if you get that wrong, it is going to affect low income and middle class workers almost 100%. It's not going to enforce the people who making the decision.
Great. Well, first, I want to thank all the conference participants for their terrific questions of David, and certainly I'm really thankful that you came and joined us today for this conversation, David. Please join me in
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.